The other day I read 71 companies are responsible for 70% of the greenhouse gases. That's the serious change room. When we sit down and get the 70 CEOs of those companies in the room and say, I'm going to name and shame you because you're one of 70 that is killing the planet. And, but nobody goes there. Nobody wants to go there. It's too intense. Just like ending slavery was intense, getting the women's vote was intense. We need to get intense, or else this climate thing is not going to turn around.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them.
Eric Lombardi has been working at the cutting edge of the zero waste and social enterprise movements across the world since the mid-90s. His working mission has been to transform the waste management industry into a resource management industry. Eric was a national spokesperson for the first zero waste organization in the U.S.A. in 1997 and was a co-founder of the Zero Waste International Alliance in 2002. Eric was invited to the Clinton White House in 1998 as one of the top 100 U.S.A. recyclers and received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Colorado Association for Recycling. From 1989 to 2014, he grew EcoCycle, a small nonprofit, into the largest zero-waste social enterprise in the USA. Eric is now the president of Buy Social USA and an associate of the Social Enterprise World Forum. In this conversation, we discuss his journey into the zero waste movement, hope versus despair in promoting for the environment, individual behavior versus systemic change, why he calls capitalism a beautiful beast, and how we can point it in safer directions. New and exciting environmentally responsible innovations in government, business, and NGOs, and his involvement with the Bi-Social movement. This conversation with Eric Lombardi is one of dozens of hopeful, inspiring conversations we've got lined up for you with leading designers, thinkers, makers, activists, and scientists who are reimagining and remaking our world today. To make sure you don't miss them, simply follow this show on your favorite podcast player. And now, let's jump right in with Eric Lombardi. All right. I'm sitting here with Eric Lombardi. Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here, Aaron. Thanks.
So we were just chatting a little bit before we started recording and COVID just came up. And this is actually usually the first question these days is, how did COVID treat you? What's the situation where you are? How did it affect your work? Anything that will bring us up to speed on the last 2 years?
Sure. I'm really one of the lucky ones because I'm 66, I'm retired, financially stable, and I didn't have to go out of my house much. So I really feel for the people that are younger and this totally interfered and disrupted their work lives and their family lives. I had kids and I raised kids and they're gone now. But if I had little kids in school right now, that would be so stressful. Yeah. So really, the big impact for me was some of the international work that I was doing came to a screeching halt. And so I haven't been able to continue with that very well. And now online conferencing is becoming a new skill set.
Yeah. I told one of my parent friends, usually I'm jealous of how, interesting and full your life is. But during COVID, I felt absolutely no jealousy of the parents. It was a good time to be single, I think. And with the international work, since a lot of people scaled back their travel, I know it's not environmentally correct to say, but we used to fly a lot for projects and all of that was gone for a year and a half. So usually in the beginning of the conversation, we like to understand the person that we're talking to and how they kind of evolved over time. And so this opening question really serves to start the conversation. It's, what's something you learned in childhood or early in life that still drives you today?
So who I am and where I'm coming from, I think is really important, right? So I'm obviously a white male growing up in America since World War II, very wealthy and powerful situation for me. When I was younger, my 17-year-old self is what I like to say, because I read once that when you're 17, you form your political views for life. So there was a few things happening for me at 17. One of them was Richard Nixon and the Vietnam War and lying from the government. And so I learned to be very skeptical and question authority. The other thing that was happening for me was my family was a small business family, and my dad's ultimate success business was being run out of business by a big corporation who was moving into town and basically taking him to lunch saying, we're going to run you out of business. You have to sell out to us. And in high school, I worked in the family business. I saw the power dynamics. It made me very upset about that. And then at the same time, all that happening, I had my inner spiritual transformation aha moment when I was in the Rocky Mountains, spent a lot of time outdoors, camping, and doing psychotropic mushrooms. And it truly changed completely who I was and how I saw the world in a very positive way. So those three things came together to create the young man who left his family's home and went out to build my own life. And here I am, 66 now, and I've had a wonderful life doing all the work that I wanted. I never stayed in a job that I didn't like. I always had the confidence, like I said, being a white male in America, that I would find a job and I could continue to grow. And that's what happened. And some of those experiences in the mountains when I was young connected me with nature in a way that the environment became my life's work.
Yeah. I have friends who are very strong into mushrooms, and now there's this whole field of microdosing, which is very interesting. I haven't tried anything myself yet, but I've done other things like meditation, and I can picture, I guess I can't fully know, but I can picture the type of insights that taking mushrooms in beautiful scenery could spark. Could you give me a little bit more on that in terms of how did that affect the rest of your journey? What happened there that was so impactful?
So I grew up in Denver, which is a fairly large city in Colorado. And I was in a kind of low-income part of town. It was pretty rough. My high school was 60% Black, 20% Hispanic, and 20% other. So I had a street life. I was streetwise, and I was thought I was a tough kid. The experience in the mountains on mushrooms got me in touch with something that was completely different than the streets of Denver and the hustle and the violence and, all of the fast life, the city life. I'll never forget the day I was lying on the ground next to a creek and I felt my body dissolve into the ground. And I realized that, we're all just kind of one here. It is all connected. It wasn't an intellectual realization for me. It was a full body experience. We are all connected. And so, I walked out of the woods and I realized that there's much more than the hustle of the city. And like I said, I'd already been politicized. And so I started looking around saying, okay, so how does this new realization play out in the bigger world? And I saw that it was not playing out very well. The hustle. The bigger world was hustling, like the city streets. I was a seeker. My mom raised me as a religious kid, and I was a quote unquote warrior for Christ and all this. So I had that ethic in me. So I was a seeker. And so I went through a Buddhist phase, and I went through a heavy Christian phase, and I went through a bunch of seeking phases for a few years. Very interested in the spiritual life, and I still am. That was one of the things you interviewed David Peter Stroh. I loved his answer at the end of your interview with him when you asked him lecture or sermon, and he gave a sermon about what young people should do. And one of the things he said was, it's very much spiritually based yourself of what you're going to work on. And so that was how I took that experience in the mountains. And my work always had a spiritual base to it that I was never afraid to talk about in public. Where nobody else was, very few people were, I was not afraid to tell people things like slavery didn't end because of a spreadsheet. It ended because of morality and ethics. And in public speakers, a lot of people don't go there. So I was comfortable talking about ethics and morality.
It's really interesting. And this idea it strikes me as very effective when you talk about the environment in these abstract or technical terms. You're missing so many people, including religious people, who you could, there's definitely a way to frame the environment for them, the God-given earth for them and protecting it that is inherently spiritual and not purely secular and technical, and would work much better for them, right?
You're absolutely right. And it's fortunate that I was working in the industry of waste management because everyone understands at a very gut level that waste is wrong. There's something wrong with waste. And I always said that the first environmental act of every good Republican is to recycle because even they get it. And so this gut thing about waste enabled me to talk to very conservative religious people, very conservative politicians. Everybody sat there and kind of nodded and said, yeah, I don't like waste. Nobody likes waste. So there was an easy bridge to walk across. But what I would like to touch on in this talk with you is once you've made that connection, how do you then move that into action? That is what I spent my whole career trying to do. And that is not easy.
Yeah, and we'll get there. I want to stay with your early years a little bit longer. I heard you say that you traveled early on. You spent time in Greece and in Europe in general. That had an important effect. Talk about that a little bit. How did that affect you?
Okay, so I took a year off high school, or gap year as they call it in Europe, and I went up and I was a ski bum in the mountains. I loved to ski, but it was also a year of debauchery. I'm lucky I survived it. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was crazy. So I got out of that, and in fact, that launched my Buddhist and Christian seeking. But then I went to college, and my first 2 years, I was a student of journalism. And I was very much enamored with some writers. And so the journalists at the University of Colorado said, no, we're not going to study them. We're very conservative, blah, blah, blah. I got very dispirited, so I dropped out of school. I went and visited my brother who was working in Greece, and I ended up staying in the Greek islands for a year. And then I went up to Western Europe and bummed around for another 6 months. And number one, that year in Greece was phenomenal because the Greek people are phenomenal. Their culture is phenomenal. It was a very poor, mostly a poor situation in the islands. But, and then when the tourists left, winter on the islands is a unique experience. And so that was great. But the real turning event for me was in Paris at a party with a bunch of young kids my age. And later in the night, some young French kid came up to me and he ripped my face off because he said, look, you're an American and you don't have a clue what your country's doing to the rest of the world. And he started asking me questions that I couldn't answer. And other people were watching. And he embarrassed me in front of this group. And he really called me out. And he said, you're stupid. Your country is stupid. You're powerful and all this stuff. He knew more about how America than I did, how America worked. So I was shocked. I left Europe and came back and studied politics, geography, American history. I realized I'm not such a smart guy after all. These kids in Europe really put me in my place. So that was a very powerful moment also for me when I was 21, I think.
Yeah. From my time, I spent many years living in New York. And what I found is, in New York, people are very aware. But if there's one blind spot for Americans, it's the rest of the world. Right? It's like America is so large and so varied and so interesting and rich that the rest of the world seems like it's very far away. And it's not, I can absolutely see myself growing in a situation where it would take until college to start developing these insights.
Let me just add, we shouldn't excuse America for that. I think the fact that young Americans are raised without understanding that we're just part of a global system and we're not, quote unquote, number one, I think that really hurts us, this whole focus on ourselves in our younger years. I think that has to change. I don't see it changing. In fact, I see education in America going the other way, more isolated and isolationist. And so I just want to say, I think that's one of the big problems of the day and one of our big chores of the younger generation right now is to keep traveling, keep making friends through the internet globally, keep this global conversation going because America is way behind.
Yeah. I totally agree with it. For me, it was mostly expressed in the news. Every time I would leave America and open the news, I would remember again that there's a whole world out there. The news in the UK and in Israel and in wherever you go, the news is global. America is the only place where you open the news and you only see American news. It's crazy.
Yeah.
It has to be a war or something of that caliber to even mention another country. It's crazy.
And it's really sad because there are so many positive stories around the world that we need to learn from and listen to. And which I actually, in my career, I brought back the progress on recycling and stuff from around the world to Americans and said, do you know what they're doing in Germany? Do you know what they're doing here? And people were like, wow, really? And so bringing the good news from around the world back home was something I did for decades. And that's to be done more.
And so I heard that you got interested in energy with the oil embargoes of the 70s. And that's a fairly aware kid that now knows about this and starts to think about the problems of energy. Is that correct?
Oh, I hate to admit this. Okay, I told you I grew up on the streets of Denver. 1973, the first oil embargo. I had my first car. And I couldn't afford gas, so I learned how to use a 6-foot rubber tube and siphon gas out of other cars into mine. I was stealing gas, but I had my principles. I would only hit Cadillacs, which were the expensive car of the day, right?
Nice.
So I hate to admit it, but that was my first brush with global politics was I couldn't put gas in my car. But the second embargo in 79, I was beyond all that juvenile delinquency. I was now in college. I was studying. I had had my Greek experience. I had had my Paris experience. So I was a different man. And I was actually focusing on alternative energy as an undergraduate in my human geography studies. And so when 79 hit, I understood it. My classes were talking about solar. In 1979, we were talking about the same issues we were talking about now. Because my first job out of college was with a solar energy company in Boulder. I was building solar on roofs. So that was my second experience with energy, a bit more positive.
Yeah, I guess Boulder is so much ahead of the curve that it was doing solar in the 80s, where, I think the rest of the world is only now catching up.
Well, you'd be surprised how much solar was going on in late 70s before Ronald Reagan became president in 80. I mean, we had a president, Jimmy Carter, who put solar panels on the White House. 78, 79 was very good years for solar energy in America and the world. I was studying Israel a lot because Israel was doing fantastic things. So, but you're right about Boulder in general. We are ahead of the curve in many ways, and it's been a pleasure to live here and enjoy that.
Yeah. Before we go into not the wasted years, but the waste years, I saw that you studied technology and human affairs as a master's. I'd love to hear this. I mean, I love the title. I don't know what it is, so I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, it was fantastic. When I was finishing with my undergrad and I went out and I traveled and I worked for a year in solar, I decided I needed a master's degree to get to the places I wanted to get with my politics and political work. So I looked around for graduate schools in the United States, and there was only one program out of the thousands that appealed to me. And it was Washington University in St. Louis, which is a very prestigious, expensive private school, and had this technology and human affairs department. Now, I knew about WashU because Barry Commoner was teaching there, and Barry was one of the pioneers of envisioning a new, greener future. And so I was like, ooh, I could be on campus with Barry Commoner. This degree of technology and human affairs sounds amazing. And so it was amazing. It was what we studied basically was what we called back then socio-technical systems. And we were studying the history of humanity and technology and the interface of tech society. So we were doing lots of energy work, and we were doing lots of environmental work, nuclear work, microwave work. My peers, we were doing fascinating work together. So yes, it was a wonderful degree. It was one of 7 in the United States that got started at the big engineering schools after 3 Mile Island had its meltdown. Because 3 Mile Island showed everybody, the politicians blamed the nuclear engineers and then saying, you said this would never happen. And the nuclear engineers pointed back and said, we never said that. You just don't know how to hear what we're saying about nuclear power. And so all of a sudden, Carnegie Mellon, MIT, Georgia Tech, Caltech, all the big engineering schools in the US started these sort of soft engineering and policy programs. And that's what this was. And I loved it. It was exactly the kind of topic I was fascinated. Politics, technology, social change, brought it all together. And unfortunately, those schools lasted only about 10 or 15 years and they kind of went away. Yeah.
That's a shame. If this program existed today, I think I would take it. It's such a good combination. And so I read that you did solar, you touched on water conservation, a lot of these big problems, and you landed in this waste and recycling sector. I'd love to hear how you got involved in it, and then tell us about EcoCycle and that whole story. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so the trajectory after grad school was basically I knew that I wanted to move back to Boulder, and I looked around town to find the job that I thought I wanted. And I found it within the local government. They weren't hiring, so I went to the guy who ran the program and said, I'll volunteer 4 hours a day, treat me like an employee. I would just like to be here to see if I like this job. And the reason I'm telling you the story is because I teach lecture at universities a lot, and I tell the kids, when you get out of college, find the job you think you want and go volunteer for it. Because if they like you, they'll open doors. And sure enough, I volunteered for 1 month, and he found salary and hired me. And that was the beginning. I never really looked for a job the rest of my career, because once you're in the field you want to be in, you start meeting people and hearing about jobs. So I got in that. I lasted about a year. And that was my government work experience. And unfortunately, it was not a great one because the staff had very progressive ideas. I was just a fountain of ideas. And 2 or 3 levels above me, somebody kept saying no to everything. And no one would ever tell me why they said no. No, we can't do that solar. No, we can't do that water conservation thing. So after about a year, I got pretty disillusioned with the way government systems make change or do anything. They have a lot of power and money, though. So I learned a lot in that year. I left that experience and ended up going with a private water conservation firm. And that was interesting for almost a year. But it was the consultancy thing. And being a consultant is really different than being an actual implementer. So I enjoyed that, but it wasn't for me either. So then I joined a large statewide quasi-non-public organization in North Carolina. And quasi-public means that the state government taxed all the energy users, electricity users, and funded a nonprofit organization to implement energy conservation, not research, but on the ground, in the trenches, implementation. And this job for 4 years was my first big professional job and really laid the path for me the rest of my time because I was in the trenches trying to implement energy conservation in the 1980s with people in rural North Carolina who didn't give a hoot about energy. I'd sit down and have coffee with the old boys. I'd bring them donuts and I'd say, we're going to fund a lighting switch out for all of the shops on Main Street so you have more energy efficient lighting. And they just look at you like you came from Mars. They're like, what are you talking about? Why are you going to give me light bulbs? What are those funny looking things? These are the compact fluorescents in the 1980s. And they said, what is that? So I spent years trying to implement energy conservation in small business, in public housing, in government and universities, churches. And so I spent a lot of time face to face with people who didn't know a thing about the topic. And I had to figure out how to sell them. I had to sell them on the idea. Fortunately, I had a suitcase full of money from the state that got their attention. So they would listen to me. Well, I was pretty good at. So finally, they made me the new project development coordinator, which meant every 3 months I had to spend $250,000 on new projects, not just my projects, but others. And so all of a sudden, I learned how to evaluate big ideas because it's hard to spend money fast. If somebody says you got 90 days, spend this $250,000 and make sure you don't blow it, that actually is a very stressful thing to do. So that was a great experience too, though, because then I was sitting down with all the innovators and I was saying, what do you got? And I would grill them. I knew enough that I could ask the hard questions and find out where they were weak and where they were going to fail. So I spent a couple of years funding projects and watching them either win or lose, succeed or not. And that was very successful. Then I'd had enough in North Carolina. It's a very conservative, weird state. My wife and I hated the summers there. So we moved back to Boulder in 1988. And I wasn't even looking for the job at EcoCycle. I joined the board as a volunteer because I knew about EcoCycle for years. I'd volunteered for it a decade before. I got on their board and immediately I saw that they were in trouble. In fact, the board was talking about dissolving the organization because the founder had done a great job, a friend of mine, Pete, had done a great job creating this nonprofit recycling organization, but he got in trouble after about 8 years or so. He couldn't handle what he'd created. So they brought in another director who was in over his head immediately. And so he had been running the place for a year and a half. By the time I got on the board, it was a mess. And so I told him it was a mess and I told him why it was a mess. And I knew how to analyze this kind of project from my experience. And they all just looked at me and said, hell, you want the job? And I was like, really? And they said, yeah, this guy's taking this down. Why don't you take it? So I said, okay, I'll give it a go. And that was 89, I guess. And it was a perfect fit because I had an organization that the foundation had been laid. Recycling was starting to get pretty popular in 1989. I had the zero waste vision in my head even then, but I didn't say it to anybody. And so first I had to whip EcoCycle into shape and get it back into the black. It was a social enterprise before that phrase was even known. I hated asking for money. I hated the grants game. I had done it. And I said, no, we're going to run this like a business because the 1990s are going to be the decade that recycling explodes. And it did. The 90s was the decade for recycling. So basically, I was in the right place at the right time, and I had the business skills as well as the nonprofit political skills to take it to the next level. There was some interesting national politics at the time, by the way, which we could talk about if you want, about why recycling actually caught fire in 1994, 95. And it had to do with the Clinton administration making a single decision. But at any rate, so that's how I got there. And in 94, 95, recycling became profitable and the big trash companies came in and started running all the nonprofits out of business. Or the governments got in and said, oh, there's money here. Let's go take it over. So all of a sudden, 1,000 nonprofits in America dropped down to 50, and that 50 dropped down to just a handful of big ones. I was the head of the National Nonprofit Recycling Association. In fact, I was a co-founder. And so I gathered the troops together in a circle and I said, we can't scale up our operations, so we need to scale up our vision. And that was the time we gave birth to Zero Waste. And we spent 3 days in the woods of Georgia, and we came up with a whole platform and a phrase. You'll appreciate this. We actually had an internal fight over the phrase zero waste because half the group said it's impossible. Why should we fly the flag of something that's impossible? And the other half was saying, because it's aspirational. People get it. It's so simple. It's to the point. And so I was the peacemaker, and I came up with the subtitle, Zero Waste or Darn Near. And that calmed everybody down. They said, okay, if 90% is okay. And we actually created a policy statement saying, we're here to change society. And if we recover 90% of these discarded resources, we will have succeeded. So zero waste or darn near means you hit 90%. That was peacemaking, and it worked. So that was really the beginning of an amazing journey, the zero waste journey.
Yeah. I love how inspirational, aspirational zero waste is. I love how clear it is. It's very powerful. Everybody can imagine it. It grabs you. And I'd love to hear, how does having a vision like that helps nonprofit compete? You had an insight there that I don't think is obvious at all. Why does a bigger vision make things easier or more viable for these organizations?
Great question. Basically, the nonprofit recyclers were scraping by financially on the resale of mostly paper and metals. We never made much on glass or plastics. So when the big trash companies started moving in on us and the government started moving in, they focused on the profitable parts of recycling. And that was the paper and the metals. And so they started to cherry pick and kill us. And that's when the bigger vision served us, because we said, no, the revenue source from newspaper pays for the recycling of plastic, because people really wanted to recycle plastic. So we said, you want to recycle plastic? There has to be another revenue source to subsidize it. And we've got that revenue source by selling our cardboard and newspaper for a profit. Or you can just go ask your local government for a subsidy. It's either or. So we had a good financial argument that the local government kind of listened to, because they didn't want to be on the hook for it either. So we said, look, it's a whole package. It's a whole basket of goods. And by the way, recycling is just the start. You know what else is in your trash can? A whole bunch of organics, and they can be composted and put back in the soil. And there's economic value there. And you know what else is in your trash can? A whole bunch of things that can be reused or fixed. And all of a sudden, we got everybody to look into the trash bin and realize 90% of what's in there can be beneficially reused. And it doesn't have to be buried or burned. But you had to keep it as a whole package. You couldn't cannibalize it. And that's where people went, oh, I'm starting to get this. So what you're saying is there is this whole industry around keeping stuff out of the landfill. And we're like, exactly. And the only losers in this positive, beautiful story is the landfill. And do we really care if they get hurt? So we could say, hey, yeah, they're the ones that are losing the money. How do you feel about that? That's okay with me. Yeah, we're going to get the money. So that's kind of how scaling the vision enabled us to stand up. But the trash haulers couldn't do that because they own the landfills. They weren't going to admit it. So they had to be quiet and sit on the sidelines and try to make their money running the trucks to collect stuff. And that was the role that we forced them into. And that's why you have single stream recycling, everything in one bin, because that lowered their cost and it created headaches for recyclers, the quality of recyclables. But that's okay. I think that was an evolutionary change. It was one of those things that kind of had to happen, because I think the last change has yet to happen. And you'll find this interesting from a technological perspective. I think where we're headed is a two-sort world where you have basically one bin for composting. And once we educate people about what organics are, and everything that's organic goes in there, then everything else goes in the other bin. You don't even have to look at it. If it's not compostable, it goes in the other bin. We call that a wet-dry system. And the wet system can become compost, and the dry system can become sortable in the automated robotic facilities of the future. They're being built right now. I've seen the robots. They work. It's not good work to stand on a pick line grabbing this stuff by hand.
No.
So here we have this automated wet-dry future where we are going to be able to recover 90% of that waste stream. There'll be a few toxic things and stuff that we can't recover, but that's how we get to the zero waste future, is the wet-dry system.
A lot of the more conscious people in their homes already have the composting pile, and then the rest of them, yes, it has to be broken down because there are multiple bins, but yeah, if you tell me some robot will sort it, then great.
Exactly.
So one thing I love about this whole idea of zero waste and how you've approached this, it's a positive vision. You're presenting a hopeful vision of how things could be of zero waste. So much of talk about the environment centers around fear, even though the fear is probably justified and these are very scary things. I spoke to, he's a designer and he wrote this book about the end of cycle problem, Joe McLeod. And his theory is that somewhere in the 18th, 19th century, we started making death more and more invisible across all of our lives. Cemeteries moved farther away, hospitals moved farther away, old people's homes moved farther away. The stores no longer, you only get the beautifully packaged products and like the waste is hidden from you. And it's something about our discomfort with death, with the end of things that makes us hide it. And so I think it's so powerful. This aversion is so powerful that a hopeful vision often just solves or has a chance to solve the problem because people don't mind talking about it. They love talking about it. They love hearing about it.
Well, I think that's really an important point. I think when you go from the intellectual realm, talking about solutions and stuff, which your podcast does a fantastic job of, into the realm of actually getting personal behavior change and social change on the ground working, then that story, that feeling becomes actually the driver. And so being able to do that is the hardest of all work. The technology side's easy. It's the actual story and getting personal behavior change that's so difficult. So yes, a good story always goes further. One of our taglines in Boulder was that we're creating opportunities for you to live according to your principles. And Boulder is a college town smart enough to get that, and they love that. So we created opportunities for people to be as green as they possibly could be. And they love us for that. And that love of the community has kept us alive because believe me, the trash haulers and government have tried to kill us over the years. But I can rally, well, when I had a job, I could pack City Hall in 2 hours with hundreds of people who would say, you don't touch this organization because they are us. They are showing us the future. So what you're saying is really critical, and getting there is really hard because climate change has so many scary, dark stories associated with it. We need to start seeing the same sort of zero waste positive feeling story in the climate realm. We really do. And that's not an easy pull. I've always seen social change as sort of a decentralized grassroots thing, and that's how recycling works. I do think that climate change is also going to be changed that way, but it needs a lot more help at the higher levels. The big systemic changes as well, not just grassroots.
For sure. You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. You were talking about Z3.
Yep.
Tell me more about that.
Okay, so the 3 Zs is zero waste, zero carbon, and zero population growth.
Yeah.
And I figured, okay, so that platform will bring together a lot of positive social change organizations who are all pulling in the same direction. We ran into a problem with the zero population growth. There's a lot of religious feelings about that, and there's a lot of people that just don't like zero population growth for different reasons. So since Z3, we sort of test marketed it. I'm down to Z squared now, which is zero waste, zero carbon communities, just because I don't want to spend my time fighting people over population growth. I really want to focus on the zero waste, zero carbon part of the work we need to be doing right now. That's what I've been doing since leaving EcoCycle. I've been working with the Social Enterprise World Forum on how do we build zero waste, zero carbon communities. And so that's the dialogue I'm involved with right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just a thought about population growth, because what I'm seeing is, and I understand why people would have a visceral reaction to this, but I've seen studies that implied that we're on our way there anyway, because the trend is as a country develops, you have less children, that it will stabilize at around, I think, 10 billion or something like that, which makes sense to me. Like effectively in my world, don't know anybody who wants to have more than two children, right? More the replacement theory. And I feel that it is something that's becoming more of a common thing, except for very specific religious populations where that's actually against the religion.
Well, and also I think low income groups in the global south. I think that they're still having a lot of children because it's an economic safety net for them. Right. But, as soon as you get some of the micro grants working with these poor families, and it's usually the woman who takes that money and turns it into a little business and they start getting some more income, they stop having babies. So I think we really need to address this income, this poverty in the global south. Because you're right, what you just said about the global north, absolutely population growth is not an issue. It's the global south.
Interesting. And so before we go into these social enterprises and all the innovation that's happening there, which I think would be a lovely thing, I heard you talk about capitalism as a beautiful beast or, a tiger or a dragon. And that's something that has to be contained, not necessarily murdered, but contained. Tell me more about that approach, how you're seeing capitalism and how we should interact with it.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. You caught that. I'm not anti-capitalist, but I see capitalism as a beautiful tiger. Beautiful to look at, strong, king of the forest, and the cubs are cute enough to go pet, but it will grow up to eat you. And so you have to put, as a human being, you have to put boundaries on the tiger, because if you don't, no matter how cuddly you think it is, it's still a wild beast and it has immense power. And that to me is what capitalism is. Capitalism has immense power. The profit motive turns people into monsters. And so what really needs to be controlled is this profit motive. And I think the discussion I find most interesting these days is the pursuit of profit. But just saying the word profit is not enough. What we have to do is say, what kind of profit? Is it a fair profit or is it maximized profit? And to me, that's the dialogue right now, because I think fair profit is like fair trade. Of course, it makes the world run. We've been doing trade forever on the planet. That's not the issue. So a fair profit is the engine for growth. I used it at EcoCycle to grow the zero waste movement. That's the engine for social enterprise.
Right.
But now what we're seeing around the planet is the people with the money are using that money to maximize their profits.
Yeah.
And once you take that headset, then there is no morality. There are no ethics. There is no community. There are only numbers. And when you live in a world of numbers, you're capable of the most horrendous environmental and human destruction that we've ever seen. And so I really want society to understand that there are two profits in the world. One's good and one's bad. And let's talk about it.
Yeah. There's a talk in the AI and algorithmic community about the dangers of optimization. Essentially, whenever you're optimizing for one number, you're necessarily destroying all the other values, because that's what optimization does. It squeezes every other number to get that thing that you're optimizing. I don't know if you've heard this parable, but it's the paperclip optimizer. It's this story about a future AI that is supposed to make paper clips for office workers, but it gets so powerful that it destroys the earth and turns it all into paper clips, right? and that's the dangers of optimizing. And so I think we talk about looking at more than one bottom line, looking at more than one value. And that leads us very naturally to this idea of these hybrid models that are cropping up now. And not everyone is aware of all the innovation that's happening. So maybe it would be a good thing to hear like an introduction to what's happening in this hybrid space. Why is it so interesting?
Okay. Before I jump into that, though, I want to compliment you because your podcast about systems is exactly the counter argument to optimization. And I think that's where what you're doing is so valuable, is because when your world becomes so small and so focused and you forget that you're part of an ecosystem that really is interrelated for many reasons, that's when we get lost. And quite honestly, I think that's where capitalism got lost. It is no longer connected to the bigger ecosystem, either social or physical, and it thinks it can exist on its own, and it can't. So that's a good segue into social enterprise, which is, to me, capitalism 2.0. It's a new way of approaching markets and the world of trade. Well, the story starts, there have been social enterprises for a long time. Your local humane society nonprofit that takes care of dogs and cats, they've been charging you for that service, right? A lot of nonprofits have been charging for service. And basically, that model is wonderful, but I ran into the ceiling on that model when I was doing zero waste, and I needed $6 million to build a new composting facility. But I can't get private investors. The nonprofit in America cannot have private investors. And so I needed either grant funders or the government or somebody to give me money. And by then, this was 2005, they were like, no, 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 the waste thing is not a thing anymore. We're all recycling and everything's cool. And I'm like, no, it's not cool. We may be recycling better, but we're not doing any of the other things. So that's about the time I discovered over in the UK a whole new movement called social enterprise, where they had created a new legal platform that would look very much like a nonprofit world, but private investors and private money was allowed to come in to help push the mission. And I said, that's what I need. I need to have private investors who believe in this mission. So I had to stop being a nonprofit in America and had to, become a for-profit entity. I didn't do that with EcoCycle, but that was the next step if we were going to keep growing as a zero waste company. So here's the deal. The definition of the new platform out of the UK, which is now spreading around the world. There's 3 things that a true social enterprise needs to meet. And I say true social enterprise because we hear a lot of talk these days about companies doing social enterprise work and all this stuff. And it's a whole bunch of greenwash, okay? Because here's what a social enterprise really is. Number 1, the genesis story of the business. It's created to fulfill a mission, either social or environmental. Number 1, that's the first hurdle you got to get over. So all of a sudden, Ben and Jerry's, who makes a great ice cream, they don't clear that hurdle. They were created to make ice cream. Now, They dedicate some of their profits to good causes. Thanks. But you're not a social enterprise, okay? You weren't created to fulfill a mission, number 1. Number 2, only a certain percentage of your profits can be returned to investors. Now, in the beginning, that number was 0 in the UK, but they have since lightened up because they realized some investors want to get something back. It doesn't have to be a market rate. Even slow money wants 4 or 5% back or something like that. So right now, the definition that we're using is 51%, at least 51% of your profits has to go back into your mission, which means 49% could go to investors. That's a hard bullet for some people to bite. And then the third one is the hardest bullet of all. And that is there is what's called an asset lock on your business. Now, nonprofits in the U.S. are already asset locked, which means I could never take EcoCycle and sell it to a person to become a for-profit company. Once you're a nonprofit, you're locked to be a nonprofit forever. And if you dissolve yourself or go out of business, all your assets have to go to another nonprofit. Well, now that's what the UK is saying about social enterprise. You're a private company, privately held, but you're locked. If you're going to go out of business, you can't sell out. You have to sell your assets or give your money to another social enterprise. So that means there's no exit strategy for venture capitalists. Okay, so that means we don't get venture money. And that's good because venture money is not good money. Venture money
risky.
it's maximizing profit money. It comes from that world of maximizing profit. So all of the incentives for venture is wrong for us. We're slow money. We're here forever. So once you legally become a social enterprise, that's it. You're that forever. There's no exit strategy. You're fulfilling your mission or you go away, period. So those are the 3 bars that an organization has to clear to be called a social enterprise. And we're having a hard time in the industry getting this accepted because there are thousands of nonprofits and thousands of quote unquote social enterprises that are close, but not quite there with those 3 things that feel like they're being excluded. And so we're trying to figure out how do we stay inclusive with all these people doing good work, but we need to, as your guest a couple of weeks ago said, you need to put boundaries around who you are and who you aren't. And that's what we've done. We've got boundaries around what a true social enterprise is, and there are certification approaches for you to be certified as one. And that becomes important when we convince corporations and governments to start procuring more services from true social enterprise. So the government and the corporations are going to want proof that they're not getting greenwashed here by some company.
Right.
Does that all make sense?
Yeah, it does. I feel like there's this vast array of possibilities when you construct a business, and it's very hard to draw the lines for me. So there's like a shoe company that for every pair of shoes that you buy, they send one to, a developing country to someone who needs shoes. They're profitable, they're growing, and I'm pretty sure that their owners are taking profit, are taking dividends. Where do they fall? There's a lot of B Corps, right? There's companies that seem to be just reinvesting their profits into the mission, into the growth, but in all other ways effectively run like a business. So I've heard the definition. What's the source of all of these? And then, how do we embrace all of them, right? How do we empower them without pushing anyone away?
You put your finger, on the argument conversation we're having within the industry right now, because you're absolutely right. We have a lot of organizations that are doing great work, but they don't clear the 3 hurdles to be called a
Right.
true social enterprise. And B Corp is a very unique situation where, we love B Corps, but really when you think about what a B Corp is, it doesn't come close to meeting those 3 standards. It's good for what it is, but it doesn't come close to becoming a true social enterprise. So how do we play with them? We're not sure. I can tell you the approach I've seen out of Canada right now. Canada, by the way, is moving forward on social enterprise in a really interesting way. They've created a target, a concentric circle target, where the bullseye is a true social enterprise. But the next ring out is something like you were just talking about, these companies that give a pair of shoes away and stuff, and that they're truly doing some good work with their profits, okay?
Right.
And B Corps. So you have these outer rings of 2 or 3 levels that are not as pure as the straight social enterprise, but they're doing great work. We think we can all coexist, and we think that corporate and government buyers and consumers, if they understand the different levels of commitment that the business is making towards fulfilling a mission, you can pick and choose how deep you want to go. If you want to go deep green or light green, you know what I mean? It's up to you. But people need to understand there are different levels of commitment. And that's the education project we have right now, to help people understand. So we've had that concept, deep green, light green, for 30 years in the recycling industry. And we're always offering people the opportunity to go light green. Just get started and you'll see it's not that hard. I'm in support of that. Getting people to participate is the hardest thing, as I said earlier. So sure, let's go light green and hopefully work you into deep green over time.
Yeah. So there's this, where I come from, people are talking about impact investing as I guess it's an even lighter version, but they are completely for profit. They want a good return on investment, but they would only invest in companies that are trying to do good in the world and where they have a mission. And the mission itself is through a for-profit product. It's just a for-profit product that empowers an underserved population or does something good for the environment, but everybody's trying to make money. How do you think about that as an additional layer to all of this? Because this is very hot right now, and I'm interviewing VCs that are doing this. And I would love to hear your...
I'm old enough to have been around when impact investing was invented. And its genesis story is that it was going to become a source of money for social enterprise and people who were pursuing change, positive change. It didn't take very long for the impact investors themselves to start demanding rates of return that were close to market. And I read recently, last year sometime, that something like 95% of impact investment funds now are demanding market rate returns. That was not the original idea. The original idea was that impact investment was going to take far less than market return. If market was returning at 8 or 10%, you were only going to have to pay 3 or 4% for impact funds. In my opinion, the impact investing community is now greenwashing. They are now just out there. They're not serving the purpose they were created to serve. There is a new source of money slowly being created by the Rockefeller Foundation in the same spirit of impact funds. They're trying to create another phrase of basically non-market rate, slow money. They want to try and recreate that again. We'll see if it takes off. I do think that world needs to define itself better and it needs to step forward better, because this whole idea of market rate return, you're not really playing. If you're demanding market rate return, then you're not really supporting a social business. You're just supporting business. And there is a difference between a social business and a regular business. There needs to be. Let's not blend them so much. And I couldn't stand it when that big consulting firm McKinsey 2 years ago came out in a report and said, by 2030, everyone is going to be a social enterprise. And a bunch of people in the social enterprise movement said, wow, isn't that great news? And I said, no, that's a disaster. They're co-opting us. It's just like all the trash companies started calling themselves zero waste companies. They co-opt you.
Yeah. It's the dilution of the term. It's inflation. But I like the idea of the concentric circles, because here's what I agree with on the impact side. I went to this impact investing summit a couple years ago, and there are people there who represent billions and billions of dollars in like retirement funds or whatever. And they have to decide how to invest this money. And they have to have good returns because they're retirement for people. And now they're applying rules to how they're going to spend it. So before, they used to invest in weapons and tobacco and like whatever made money. And now they're saying, no, actually, if they're actively doing harm, we're not going to invest in them. And in fact, we're only going to invest in companies that are doing, through their product, through profits, going to do good. Now, this in itself, I think, is praiseworthy. You're in charge of a lot of money. You need to decide what to do with it. You apply basic rules. You're not a charity, and you're not even empowered to lower the rates that you need because you're people's retirement. So that makes sense to me. I have every retirement fund in the world, which represents ungodly amounts of money, be more impact oriented. And I understand the concerns about the term, but is it really a bad phenomena that people are concerned with it? Or is it just the term that's being co-opted and let's protect the term, but do the thing?
Okay, so go with me here because I'm going to take you on a leap.
Okay.
And I'm going to overstate my case because I think it's important for people to hear. Even if I go a little bit too far here in what I'm about to say, I'm going to make the point.
Okay.
There is such thing as incremental change and meaningful change. And what I would say is incremental change is the world you just described. We're playing on the fringes once again. And this is after 40 years of watching how hard it is to make serious change. There's some areas in life on Earth right now where incremental change is no longer a good thing because it's holding us back from serious systems change. Okay. I was a great supporter of impact investing when it was born because I thought there's the money we need to make serious change. And I watched it never leave the room in the house that's called incremental change. So now let's talk about what really makes change in the world. It's power, it's money. When I say power, I mean raw power. I mean ruthless power, the kind of power that kills people and they don't look back. Okay. We're not in that world. Impact investing won't touch that world. That's too political for them. And so that's my problem now, is that serious social change needed with the climate. Before I got on today, I was thinking, what serious social change has ever happened? And I came up with 2 examples, and I'd love it if you could come up with a third.
Okay.
In the U.S., we absolutely ended human bondage, slavery. That was a serious change. We fought a war over it. That was real. And the second serious change I came up with was women are allowed to participate by voting. That was a serious social change.
But no war was fought over that. That was a more incremental process.
So what was it that these 2 changes took? It was decentralized grassroots and many decades of pressure.
Yeah.
So if you can come up with a third, I'd love to hear it because I think we're at that point right now with some of the problems on the planet where we all have to leave the incremental change room. We all have to stop being satisfied with incremental change. I'm not going to condemn them because yes, it's good work. And yes, they're creating models for us to build off of. But I'm in the serious change room now saying, what's it going to take for those incremental changes to scale up and become serious change? And what it's going to take is raw power and money the way they have it. The bad guys, the status quo, the ones that are at the source of the problem. Like the other day, I read 71 companies are responsible for 70% of the greenhouse gases. That's the serious change room. When we sit down and get the 70 CEOs of those companies in the room and say, I'm going to name and shame you because you're one of 70 that is killing the planet. And, but nobody goes there. Nobody wants to go there. It's too intense. Just like ending slavery was intense, getting the women's vote was intense. We need to get intense or else this climate thing is not going to turn around. So that's where I'm taking the leapfrog from one room to the other. Let's talk about serious change now. How do we scale up?
So I'm wondering, so you said you have a background in Buddhism. In the world of Buddhism, there are 2 approaches to enlightenment, right? There's sudden enlightenment and gradual enlightenment. And some of the more interesting approaches to this, to me, imply that they're not actually different, that there's an increment until you reach a tipping point and then it's sudden, right? And to me, that speaks to maybe what happened with gay rights and gay marriage, or where progress seems to almost not happening at all. And then boom, suddenly like fait accompli, like it's done. Nobody's even talking about it anymore. And I wonder if definitely in the Civil War, like in the issue of slavery, that these wars were fought for a century, ideological, political, until that moment. So it's interesting. I feel like I'm with you with wanting sudden change, but I'm also wondering if it's just the visual, that it looks sudden, but there's always been a gradual.
This is a wonderful conversation. I don't have the answers, but my theory of social change is similar to what you just said. I call it the water bucket. And every good action is like a drop of water in the bucket until the bucket fills up. And then something happens to kick it over. And the water washes over all of us. And it's hard to imagine life any other way because we're all wet, right?
Yeah.
So I think that keeping with that vision, I think what we need to do is we need to turn on the sprinkler rather than drops. Now we have to turn the hose on and we have to start filling that bucket faster, more meaningful. And that's the level of commitment going from the incremental to the serious change world. No more drops. Now it's time to turn the hose on. And I think that I don't know how we turn the hose on, but you're right. It starts slow and it builds and then all of a sudden it happens. I agree. I think that's how it happens.
So it's interesting. And this is part of what you're doing. So you're an associate at the Social Enterprise World Forum, and you're working with all of these new types of entrepreneurs, new types of social entrepreneurs. And you also are the president of Social U.S.A, which I think is the other side of this. It's the side that tries to empower these social enterprises.
Yeah.
So do you want to give me a picture of?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I guess my primary interest in the social enterprise world is, as I said, is to build zero waste, zero carbon communities. And in order to get there, I believe that this conversation about fair profit versus maximizing profit brings us to a discussion about our energy and waste systems that are run to maximize profits right now. And we need to turn that into a fair profit industry, not a maximum profit industry. That's how we're going to start turning the energy industry and the waste industry in the direction we need to go. That means more public involvement, more public ownership. I'm not crazy about governments owning and running stuff because I've been on the inside. I know how they think and act. They're just not creative. They're just not risk-taking, but they're an essential partner. So I'm very much in favor of social enterprises taking over the complete energy and waste management industries. 100% becomes social missions. 100% becomes fair trade businesses, not maximum trade businesses. If we're going to do that, we have very few social enterprises at scale that could do that. We're starting to see some very interesting examples in Wales and Scotland where communities are starting social enterprises themselves. All the people who live in that town are a shareholder, and they're building their own wind and solar energy systems. So it's community-owned energy system. I think that's the beginning of the path that we all need to go on. In the U.S., we're probably just going to have to nationalize these two industries. And that's the kind of radical change that I would like to push to get the dialogue going. Because if the energy and waste industry sees the grassroots seriously talking about nationalizing their businesses, then they are going to engage. If we actually can muster the power to scare them, they'll come to the table to protect their role and their profits. So we need enterprises to scale up to the point that a corporation or a government can then procure from them the services. We don't have that right now. So Social U.S.A is an organization that's helping corporations, government understand what social procurement would look like. What does it look like to spend the tax dollars to create the world we want, is the tagline I like to use. Because we're spending our money on stupid stuff, stuff that makes the problem worse. And that's our tax dollars, right? And let's get the government so they don't feel like it's this radical thing. In the US, I mean, they already spend 5% of their budgets on minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses, right? So this idea of procurement preference is not new. But again, we need to scale it up. But then we have to have the enterprises big enough to meet their needs. And so we have a chicken and an egg right now. So it's a very interesting time to be alive, because I think if the social enterprise philosophy emerges as credible, I got to tell you, zero waste was laughed at for 10 years. From 1996 until 2005 or 6, I was not given an audience. We were laughed at, even by the old recycling pioneers. They thought we'd overstepped our boundaries. We weren't accepted by the world in about 2008. And I don't know why, but that year, everything happened. Smithsonian Magazine, NPR, you name it, everybody wanted to be zero waste all of a sudden. So it took a decade. Yeah. I see the same pattern happening with social procurement and social enterprise and fair profit versus maximum profit. We're laughed at now. But I think we can get to the point where we can say, hey, a fair profit, let's call it 7% of a big number, is a big number. You can still make a buttload of money if you're in the energy and waste industry, because the numbers in energy and waste are huge. See where I'm going with this? We need to have the credible story, which is why I love coming on shows like yours to talk about this and think out loud about it, because we need to find the language and the imagery and the storytelling for people to realize this is not radical. This is just a new way of getting where we want to get, and people still get to make money getting there. They just don't get to gouge us.
It's a new type of marketplace. It's not very different from these logos that are cropping up on products to let you know that it's, GMO free or gluten free or like healthy choice or what have you. It's completely actually within the market system, which is exciting and I think can make a huge difference because, again, it's about the flow of money. And the flow of money is very powerful in our world.
Exactly. So it's another good story. Like zero waste, this is another good story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a closing question for you coming in a bit, but I'd love to hear if you can help me think through my selfish business thinking. When I started, I have a design agency. I work with companies large and small to help them design their product and services. And I had a very strong aspiration to be involved with design for good, to be involved with governments and NGOs, which of course they can't really afford our services or prices. So I'm trying to figure out how to structure the business. And I like maybe the idea of the pair of shoes, of the extra pair of shoes, where we can be both, where I can charge a premium from companies that are going to make a lot of money from our services, and then spend some of our time helping organizations that can't pay but will do a lot of good. What would be your thinking process if you approach this? And I know there's so many different ways to go.
It's a wonderful question. I think it's great that you want to go that direction. And I guess off the top of my head, I would recommend that you become one of the visionary voices in design for the environment, because that DFE is a big deal. It never got the attention it should have. I checked out your profile on LinkedIn and you've been in the trenches. So you know what reality is like out there. But I think the world of design can handle it. I've worked with enough industrial designers to know that they want to go there, but the pressures from above to make money keep them from going where they want to go. So here's my idea. If you're going to put some money into this, just create a spin-off social enterprise of your own who has a mission of promoting the vision and story of DFE. Okay? That's your high ground. And you put all of your, whatever you can afford, you put into it. One full-time staff person in that company could do a hell of a lot for you as far as storytelling, setting up the situation, being your aspirational angel on your other shoulder, right? And you'll be surprised. That's like honey. The bees come to honey. You'll be surprised who comes to that and says, I want to play with you. Then all of a sudden, funding and people and everything else will start to emerge that will make activities possible where you can make a fair profit. But keeping your other business going is essential so that you can fund that effort until it can fund itself. Okay? So I think if you were to form a true social enterprise with the 3 bars that I said, and your goal first is for it to do enough to cover its costs, but if not, you're feeding money over into it to keep it going, because that is your aspirational platform. You're feeding the vision of design for the environment, which needs to be fed.
Interesting.
If you could pull that off, that would be fantastic.
So you think of it as a separate organization because it needs to operate by nonprofit rules and maybe be able to accept donations, and it's a separate entity. Okay.
It's a separate entity. It clears those 3 bars, but you're its founder. You're the primary founder of it, knowing that organization has to play by different rules than the one you're running right now.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so I think it's time for our closing question, which I think you've heard before. Alain de Botton in his TED Talk talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture being the modern day secular equivalent of a sermon, where you just get a little bit of information and you get to make up your own mind. And a sermon is a more urgent plea that's trying to change your life in some way. So I would like to give you the stage for a short sermon for change makers, for people who want to make a difference in some way. What can you teach them that would really change the next 40 years of their lives? Go.
Yeah, so I think this is the kind of question at college level I'd like to talk to the kids about. When I leave this room, when you leave this room, where are you going to go? And my experience as a white male in America, let's make sure we understand where I'm coming from, is that true social change has 3 levels, just like personal change has 3 levels. So you've got your head, your heart, and your spirit. And all 3 of those, the Holy Trinity, comes together, not only in yourself, but in society. And you just need to know how to integrate them. You need to know when to go with which of the 3 in a systems, because you are part of a system. And sometimes your head is going to be needed, and other times your heart is going to be needed, and other times the spiritual vision is going to be needed. So pay attention to all 3 and keep your eye on the prize. And that would be the last thing I would say is create a goal. I liked what you said the other day about VUCA.
Yeah.
Very interesting. But, things like waste and climate change, let's just say waste. Waste is not a VUCA issue. Waste is not rocket science, okay? But you have to have a very clear vision of where you're going if you're actually going to go into that room called serious change and not incremental change. So be clear on where you're going. Use all three of your energy sources, your spiritual, your emotional, and your intellectual sources of energy, and stay true to that vision and just keep living it and just keep pushing it in a positive way. And people come to you. You create that energy that people like, they come to you. And before you know it, it's fantastic. Things are happening. And the more we all do it, the more hope we have for a better future.
Thank you, Eric.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.